I'm Isabella and you're listening to Zeno. Each month I have conversations with people from all walks of life about their personal stories of home, identity and the search for belonging. Stephanie Sy-Quia, welcome to the show. It's wonderful to have you here and I'm grateful to you to be able to speak about Amnion. And I'd love to actually start with a reading because the first question I usually ask my guests is, how do you answer the question, where are you from? And what truths are missing from the answer that you give? And I feel like your writing Amnion answers that question perfectly. So I'd love to start with a quick reading.
Yeah, I think I know exactly the passage you're referring to. So, your mum is Filipino? Ah, Filipina, if you're a woman. Like Latina, same empire. So your mum is Filipina? No, my dad. Oh, where are you from? My reply, only as of late. I'm British, but was born in the States and grew up in France, and I'm half Filipina. Oh, okay, wow. So your mum is half Filipina. Where are you from? My mother is British, but grew up in West Germany, and my father is Filipino, but grew up in Spain, and they met here, but had me in California, and then moved to France, and now I am here. Oh, okay. Wow. Where are you from? My grandmother on my dad's side is Filipina, but was exiled to Spain for getting pregnant, and my grandfather on my mum's side was a Catholic priest, and there's a gap in the story. The story resumes when he's been defrocked, and they're married, and they fled the scandal to Libya to be teachers, and my mother was born there, and from there they went to West Germany, and my parents met here, but left when their friends turned back into their English upper-middle-class parents, so went to California, and there they had me, but then they moved to France, where we lived for 11 years, and now I am here. Oh, okay, wow. Oh, okay, wow. No room in their view for people like me.
It was such a gift to read Amnion and for the first time to even experience shared lived experience in the writing in something that I was reading, and I'm so grateful to you for that. And I'd love to ask you, what does Amnion mean to you?
So the word itself is something that I saw in a biology textbook when I was 15 years old. I was preparing for my GCSEs, and at that time there was the very initial seeds of Amnion, like little phrases I had written down, but really just a clutch of them. But I remember seeing that word and thinking, that's it. That's the name of the thing I'm working on. But I suppose I hadn't really thought of it as working, but I thought that's the name of the thing. I'm going to write a thing and it'll be called that. And an amnion is the outermost membrane of the amniotic sac. So we've all been in one. And I think what is interesting to me about it is that it is something that encloses us in order to keep us safe so we can grow. But a part of that growth is that we eventually need to come out of the amnion and come into the world and come into a fuller sense of self. So I was using the word as a way of thinking about the structures which enclose us, but should only ever enclose us for a time, and that we should be constantly trying to move out of the bounds of our lives in order to grow up and become more fully ourselves and more fully free and more fully conscious. And that process is ongoing.
And what would you say, what boundary are you currently crossing right now?
That's a good question. I am reconsidering the role of romantic relationships in my life. I'm thinking a lot about long-term romantic relationships between men and women. And I think I'm grappling with really quite a strong pessimism about that ultimately. But there's also immense liberation in that and joy. So I'm having a lot of conversations with friends whom I love very much, which are very life-affirming conversations about that topic.
And yeah, I think that metaphor of amnion, so many boundaries that we're crossing, and I think especially for people who encompass multiple identities at once, it's a really powerful metaphor. And there were so many things that I loved in the book, and this juxtaposition between the harsh walls of the cathedral and breaking apart the different parts of the cathedral through the book. But then there's that amniotic feeling, mothering and matrilineal heritage, and these notions of family and care and love, and what do those mean in that context. There's so much that I shared in terms of your lived experience that you spoke about in the book. I also went to boarding school. I lived in a boarding school for 8 years. I loved the way that you captured so much of that experience, and that felt really nourishing. And to like see it from a third party perspective, it's almost like I was immediately transported back, but with so much wit in those words as well. Trousers like the color of red meat, all the connotations of violence, and that comes with that. Yeah, I'd love to know a bit more about your embodied practice in writing the book. I think you've spoken a bit before about how being embodied was a part of the writing process for you. Sound was a really important part of this process for you. So I think if you could talk a bit more about that, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So the boarding school I went to was affiliated with Canterbury Cathedral, one of the most important religious sites in the UK. And the school is very old. It dates from the foundation of St. Augustine's Abbey, it dates from the 6th century, like the beginnings of Christianity on these islands. And so therefore a lot of the school complex is just incredibly old. You find yourself walking through the cathedral cloisters. There was a sort of covered passageway called Dark Entry, and God knows how long it had that name and why. And some of our classrooms were sort of 700 years old and that kind of thing. And the material reality of being in an environment that old is that a lot of it is made out of stone, which is a building material that you actually have to be of a certain class and educational background to experience on a regular basis. So I became fascinated by how, as a young woman, I started at that school when I was 14, and so I really underwent puberty in earnest whilst I was there. And I was walking around these vast, imposing stone structures, and I very much had a sense of being an interloper, that it was really very recent that I would have even been allowed to be in those classrooms in receipt of that knowledge. And as an institution, I think the school had gone co-ed in the 90s and still hadn't really cracked how to deal with having young women around. So the messaging around being a female student at that school was one which is very widespread, of preemptive victim blaming, don't put yourself in dangerous situations. And there was no counter messaging to the young boys and men at that school to say don't sexually assault girls, etc. And so I became fascinated by a certain profile of white British upper middle class or middle class man who might be born in a beautiful Georgian house, or a sort of, let's say, an upper middle class person who lives in a mock Tudor or genuinely Tudor house, and then goes to a school where the building looks similar and is made of stone. And they go to the prep school, and then they go to the secondary school, which is a very fancy secondary school that's probably quite famous. Then they go to an Oxbridge college where, again, the buildings look the same. And from there, they could go into Parliament or the Inns of Court or stay at the university. And again, the buildings look the same. And they would end up living in a beautiful Georgian house again, made of stone. So from the cradle to the grave, they can walk through something that looks like a cloister and think, yes, I'm allowed to be here. I am not an interloper. And it provides this kind of extraordinary societal exoskeleton whereby they never really have to think too hard about who they are or what they are agents of, because they're just safely ensconced. And that's how they move through the world. And I found that fascinating as a young woman of mixed racial heritage, because I thought this place cannot adjust its worldview to encompass me, and therefore I must try and write about it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think you handled so beautifully in that is in that kind of experience, when you are the interloper, there isn't an opportunity for anybody to really understand what your perspective might be on that. So it felt like this book was a way to say, see, this is how it really is for us. That I felt was really nourishing and affirming. All the nuances of that experience of being closed off in a building with these people for 8 years. That's what it actually felt like. What insights did you gain about your personal sense of girlhood having written the book?
Ooh, good question. It's interesting because the book came out in the afterglow, shall we say, in so much as we can say there is one, of Me Too as well. And those issues were issues that had been at the forefront of my mind before 2018. But I think what I found remarkable about how our possible futures were alluded to was that no one really wanted to make us see that in so many cases you can be a really ambitious young woman and get the really good exam results and go to the fancy university and get the degree, and yet you will still be expected to find a man your age and house train him, and that there will be a slow male erosion of your ability to live out your full potential. It was just like, don't wear a short skirt because don't go out at night because you'll get raped, not you'll end up 45 with your wealth in many different interpretations of the word, like spiritual or material, just being like cramped by male mediocrity. Maybe that's a bit too much of a mic drop answer. But I think there was this sense of being like just another female animal that was being ushered into this industrial processing machine of like, get a career, but don't get too much of a career because we also need you to like have kids at what we deem an appropriate age.
Yeah, well, I think the erosion is a good word to use for that. Like the way the rain that just colours like a sculpture over time.
Yeah.
It was amazing to see you grapple with that and the conflict of the entrapping feeling of being in that environment, but also being told to be ambitious. And a huge part of the book is around family, and there's a sense that there's, with the layering of different members of your family's experience, it's almost like in a family constellation, you're like paying respects to each person in your family and in all their nuances. And I just wonder, what does liberation look and feel like for you on the context of your life now, having written Amnion over a period of 9-10 years? What does that look like for you?
Liberation. Wow. That's such a vast question. Well, it's funny because I have wanted to be a writer since before I could read. I was read to a lot as a child, and that's why. So I'm very grateful for that. And I was read things like Narnia and The Hobbit, and I was given Philip Pullman's novels to read, his Dark Materials trilogy to read as a youngish child. And so from a really young age, I wanted to go to Oxford as well. My hopes and dreams from about the age of 5-6 were go to Oxford, write a book. And now I've done both of those things. And how I feel about Oxford has changed a lot since I passed through that institution, and that a lot of that thinking is in the book as well. But Amnion, and I hope that I will have many more books. Well, not even many, but just I hope I have a few more in me and that I can stand behind them proudly. But Amnion is basically my whole thesis. I think a lot of my subsequent work will be in dialogue with Amnion, and that I've laid the foundations for my thinking for a long time in Amnion. I was in an airport recently about to get on a transatlantic flight, and I had one of those like pre-flight moments that I've never had before where I thought, you know what, if it all goes down in flames and it falls out of the sky into the sea, it's all good because I've done what I came here to do. I wrote a book that really says everything I want to say, and putting it out into the world went really as well as it possibly could have, as I could possibly have hoped for. And in it, I hope I've managed to say I love you to all the people who matter. And therefore, as a lifelong anxious overachiever, I find myself in a bizarre position of actually feeling quite zen about the rest of my life. So I'm looking around thinking, well, I've fulfilled my dreams and now I need to come up with new ones, but there's no rush to come up with new ones. So really, in the meantime, I want to just make sure that I'm still nurturing myself and those around me. And that's a novel feeling for me. It's a fun feeling and a strange one, and really quite pleasant. I would recommend it.
Sounds like a beautiful position to be in. Well, that's great.
So that's liberating.
That sounds wonderful. And I'd love to ask you to do another reading.
Of Canterbury, I recall scuff, stone smell, shoe seep, smell at crotch of tights, blazer. To the school, I'm delivered. A 3-hour drive north through a veiled land replete with cathedrals. There is Amnion with its traces of paint still, and Chartres of the windows. Beauvais unfinished. 3 times its spire fell through. Now it is braced with wooden beams on crutches. It boasts the highest clerestory in Europe. It smells of mouldering stone. Reims, where are buried the kings. Coulon, which boasts the foreskin of the Saviour. Under the channel to burst forth near a hill where runs a horse, white in chalk. I remember that boat, smallest to answer the call. Named Tamzine, it lies on the floor of the Museum for Imperial War. The littlest of the little ships of Dunkirk, clinker-built from Canadian spruce. The school is of flint and brick. It too has a cathedral. At the boarding house, which is new, but built out of the ruins of the old infirmary 10 centuries old, another mother is wearing a poncho. She asks where we're from, how we got here. At my mother's reply, the Eurotunnel, she says, "Oh well, you will have come in under our land then." I am unpacked and stowed away. Later that night, the others start to arrive. There are 5 blondes in a total of 12. There is lacrosse gear and lurid pink mouthguards. Their jeans are different from mine, tighter. I've never seen so many sets of big breasts. Their hair is mid-length. It swishes. Their clothes are all somehow the same. Are you rich? The others wait politely for my reply. The land seemed so old, but deluded also. The white horse that leaps on the green hill, singing in chalk, is a copy. The stone of the cathedral came from Caen, where as a child in an oversized fleece, I stood in a very large crater near the Museum of Peace. My father was at D-Day and was shot in the hip. He lay on the beach in the surf for 3 days. My godfather has my baby sister strapped to his chest. This cool, cold plain of Europe's beige edge is on par with Mont Saint-Michel, its great flat-footed expanse where my brother and I dig its ridges for clams before the tide comes running. This is deep bone-knowing country. Albion. I hold it in my mouth with pleasure like a corpulent pearl. It contains all the stories England tells itself, a plosive, bounded space, girded by neat cliffs and Land's End. How they thought of their virgin queen, the whole universe under her skirts. The dean beckoned me and with his thumb upon my forehead said admitto te, and I, having for sole reference the Simba smudge, stumbled on the stiff white surplice lent to me on a 2-year lease. They were so blithe about the signifiers of their station. They had hairless pits and thighs, and paid, from the age of not yet fucking or fingering, for bikini waxes. They had an easy greed and met me with incomprehension when I tried in vain to explain where I came from. Food was a thing ingested under mild duress. My femalehood was bordered over my eyes like a set piece. To determine its deviance became the all-consuming aim. Cover your shoulders. Shoulders remind boys of boobs. My body became as incendiary as a vernacular. It was trailing in the dark woods, at the ends of sentences, at the short edge of night and late at skirt. The blonde others aspired to be described with mean, hard-nosed little words, thin, pretty, nice. I wanted big female words like wise and kind. The boys were always touching each other. When the parents came, they were loud. They came 2 by 2 in pairs of Sunday lunching racists. The fathers wore trousers the colour of rare meat. A hunk of roast beef seeping, banking on things in the city, with flats useful for unfaithing. Their wives stayed at home in the counties. Maybe they were lonely and screamed themselves hoarse in the cut-stone quiet of their houses. These marriages seemed structures of mutual scorn. Watching them made me flush hot with fear that this was coming for me and sent me knock-kneed to hide. Their days of barbered torpor, the cream-coloured afternoons. I wanted big-beamed love. I wanted to be one of the women who swear and have grey in their hair. I wanted, though this too was warped, to be the emotional centre without which nothing can hold. In our lesson, the timelined people have made landfall in America. They find that the people there are untimelined. According to the landfalls, they have no history. This is something that even the ancients did not know. This is something entirely new. Everything is uncertain. The world is of unknown proportions. Luther is nailing a piece of paper to a door. He is standing saying, I stand before you now, and can do no other. Everything is chaos. Nothing is known. The universe is a black womb rioting with stars. On the staircase in the history block was a framed print. We shall fight them on the beaches. All around it dotted coats of arms and rays of light, which seemed a slight confusion.
I felt when I read it the first time, I was immediately transported to the very first day that I arrived at boarding school. The way you describe yourself like an object, I was delivered this sense of objectification from the date of arrival. And that question makes you think how much the boarding school institution and complex, its inheritance and its perpetuating the accumulation of assets and the ways that the city's propped up. And I thought it was such a powerful way to describe it. I wonder, what has been an antidote for you in feeling othered or feeling isolated?
Well, so I'm part of the Ledbury Critics program, which was founded by Sandeep Palmer and Sarah Howe, 2 poets, in 2017, I believe, to basically increase the number of poetry critics of colour writing for UK and Irish publications, because there was a sense that while there were more poets of colour being published, there wasn't the critical infrastructure to receive them with the sensitivity that they deserved. So through that program, I believe there are now 21 of us in the UK version of the program, and some of those critics are some of my dearest friends. And that program, I joined it in 2019 when I had just gone freelance, and I was just absolutely terrified, and I didn't really feel I knew anyone or that I had much experience. And I've said so many times before that I completely credit them with giving me my vocation and a really life-affirming sense of purpose. And so it's really the fellowship of the people I met through that program that just continues to infuse me with so much energy. And of course, there's such incredible variety among us critics, but I think it's coming together and celebrating that variety and those nuances and being able to poke fun at our cultural establishment just brings me so much joy.
Wow.
And rest as well.
Beautiful. And one of the things I loved so much about Amnion is how you include all the languages that are a part of who you are without translation. I think that is so important. And it almost felt amniotic in the way that you could let these languages move through the text. And I also can understand languages that you put in the book. So that was just so affirming to see that on the page. And I'm interested in these movements about really trying to not force people to translate themselves or put things in quotations and italicize. It was wonderful to see you do that in the book.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's really important to me. I've written an essay on this, actually, and it's something I discussed with Sarah Howe, the notion of ambient language. So, like, how you can have a language spoken around you which can be deeply familiar to your ear, even though you don't actually understand its content. And also, if you want to find out what a word in my book means, your phone is probably nearby and you can look it up. And that's an option that a lot of people have. You do have recourse to the information and you can use your own initiative. But I think also, and this was part of my discomfort at being repeatedly asked where I was from in a sort of elite British educational environment, is that they're not actually really interested in the answer. And so by being forced to explain it again and again and to offer a translation of yourself or of the words in your book, you're actually trapping the discourse about identity at such an infantile level. And that is by design. They're not actually interested in raising the stakes of how we talk about who we are and how you make a person. And so I think with Amnion, once and for all, I wanted to answer the question. I always joke that I'm going to do this, and I never actually have because it would be pretentious. But, I always joke that the next time someone asks me that question, I can say, for further information, please refer to for the price of $10.99.
Invest in me.
Yeah.
I love that. I think you should. I think more of us should do that. What does home taste, sound, smell, and feel like for you?
So that's a beautiful question. My sister gave a really beautiful answer to this question, which I think I'm going to borrow from her, which is that, and I suppose it's not an exact answer to your question, but covers some of the terms of it. Home is a kitchen that is familiar to me, where I know where everything is. So I feel extraordinarily lucky to have an abundant extended family, and those friendships and family friendships are really like the stars in the sky. They're sort of the navigational firmament for me. And so they're homes, and they are home to me.
I'd love to one more reading if possible.
An interview imagined. Tell me about the Philippines. Well, within the colonized, it bears something quite particular. They say the Austronesians, when they plied forth on their pirogues, were grated up onto these shoals and sands because of currents. And similarly, in the Pacific, we're quite hot property at this crossroads of the South China Sea. Sea only, Scarborough. So we had the Chinese too. And before, but between, Muslim traders from Jakarta who've given us words in dialect such as salamat. Then the Spanish, whose crown prince's name we still bear when most others have cast off. Have I told you of the galleons, greatest of their craft and weighing 100,000 tons, replete with silks and silver? The journey to Alta California took 4 months, one of which alone was spent getting out from among the spined islands, a most deadly volcanic constellation. And then the British, briefly, from whom America came to wrangle. I've known people to resent I have not made it more apparent. There are those who would read in the planes of my face what they wanted, the fictions they wished me to fill, or the cutout behind which it might be convenient to crouch. I will braise it into dishes for your delectation. My peers knew nothing of the Philippines. They travelled in arcs through Southeast Asia, but it was Vietnam they stopped in for street food. They took mushrooms on the beach in Thailand. The pictures trickled back. coconut-bounded cocktails with candy-coloured paper parasols, frangipani flowers plucked and tucked behind one ear, open shirts and bintang beer, swimming under waterfalls, and endless pictures of gleefully riding mopeds. They did not know about the first overthrow of colonial rule in Southeast Asia, or José Rizal, or that the Spanish was the first empire on which the sun never set, or the People Power Revolution as recently as 1986, which ricocheted, reappearing elsewhere. Tell me about José Rizal. He was an ophthalmologist. He also discovered an eagle and 2 types of butterfly when in exile on Mindanao. He had terrible eyesight, but was nonetheless arrestingly good-looking. He advocated for self-representation in the Cortes General, much like, to this day, what Puerto Rico does not have. A modest demand, you would think. So they shot him. Tell me about revolution. It was the summer of 1986. I was doing my prelims at the time. It was so exciting because every time I came out of an exam, there were updates. The coverage was good because it was an easy place for journalists. English speaking, lots of sex. At the sit-ins, the best was lunchtime. Everyone just sat down, got out packed lunches, and ate together. People picked their way through the crowds with ube rice cakes wrapped in banana leaves, even in the hot sun, sitting on a freeway overpass. My father and I had said in unison once before, "Manila light," at the strange mercurial's quickening. He smiled at me, that I had noticed. Half Filipina. Well, actually a quarter. What? A fragile sense of self shattered on the Etoile roundabout. The eternal flame at the tomb of the unknown soldier has been extinguished only once. After the Euros in 1992, someone pissed on it. It was a firing squad on December 30th, 1898. It is said his last words were consummatum est, but that could well be wishful thinking. When my father's true blood Pinoy is probed, the deflection has been, by some, the word mestizo, an 18th century system to split the muddling of the blood by degrees and iterations. Spanish and Indian, mestizo, mestizo and Spanish woman, castizo, Spanish woman and black man, mulatto, Spanish and mulatto, Spaniard and albino, torna atras, Indio, Indian, and torno atras, lobo, lobo and Indian woman, Zambaigo, Zambaigo and Indio woman, Cambujo. I went to Manila the summer I slumped into depression, a word which speaks to me as of the gas in a quickly closing chamber. The wings were unfolded now, and drying in the warmth of me, and the shadow foe beneath them rocked on its haunches on the sill of my chest. I could not heave it out, and struggled to breathe. But had I gone, so as to use the monsoon as pathetic fallacy for my state of mind, or to rediscover an auto-orientalized sense of self? I rode on the roof of a jeepney, and when the fare collector climbed aboard to tell me the rain was coming, I kicked myself for noting it Conradian. Why had I not equipped myself for this? I read the nollie. It struck me as having been written in a hurry. Previously, in England, I had felt compelled to make it loudly known. The performance of otherness was for their benefit, because I felt without it they might always have this knowledge gap, and this was not something I wished for them. I startled myself, marking the jungle and all its truisms. I stepped off the plane in Bacolod, an Arabic sea, mind you, provincial capital of Negros Occidental. Here I can feel you holding your breath. You are waiting. I can feel you waiting. A hush not so much of respect but of expectation. You are waiting for me to tell you how the air was close, that it was hot, that the atmosphere and then fairly quickly myself was sticky. There was the ruptured cone of a volcano, black and bright green, and there were thin tall palm trees like a print our father kept. At the height of the Spanish Empire, it took 1 year for a letter to reach Madrid from Manila. Manila was not alone in being known as the Pearl of the Orient.
It was so wonderful to see how masterfully you could navigate all the different levels of story that we're told about our identities. And you made points to make that known to the reader through brackets, and you also unravel self-exoticization and fetishization and, as you say, like, or self-orientalism in the book. What advice would you give to someone who perhaps is struggling with that sense of self-exoticization? How have you personally found yourself working through that?
So for me, it's been a difficult process, and I would say almost that my thinking has evolved beyond what in Amnion now, because I didn't have much guidance from my father in how to express my Filipina identity. That's for reasons of his own, which are complicated, and I respect that. And it meant that I had to reach past him to my Lola, my grandmother, who is very proudly Filipina. And that was beautiful because it provided a very wonderful basis for us to have a relationship once I became an adult. And she is an incredible cook. So one big interface of it was through food and exploring cooking Filipino food, eating Filipino food together. And that's delicious. It's joyous. It's convivial. So I think that can be a very good way of doing it. Do it in a way that's convivial and that is predicated on sharing. And the other thing is that I might not sound as if I'm half Filipina, and I might not always look it. It tends to depend on who's doing the looking. Other people of mixed racial heritage can normally tell that there's something going on. But I have a very Filipino last name, and I'm never ever going to give it up. It's always going to be cooler than everyone else's last name. I'm sorry. So if I get married, it's not going to go anywhere. And that means that people ask about my last name all the time. And I think before I really had figured out how to express being part Filipina, that was always the thing that people asked about, was my last name. And I think the conclusion I've reached now is people are going to ask you anyway. So you should have an answer. And make sure that answer is something that is joyous and convivial, but also knowledgeable. And yes, you should be proud of it. I know you don't have to wear it on your sleeve, but those questions are going to come for you anyway. And especially in the case with the Philippines, where there isn't a very acknowledged imperial relationship between the UK, where I live now, and the Philippines, it tends not to be on British people's radar. Like, they tend not to really know much about it or even be particularly aware of it, which always I find amusing from a sort of tourism perspective, because British people famously are really bad at learning other languages. And so, like, why wouldn't you go on holiday to a part of Southeast Asia where English is spoken so widely? But anyway, that's beside the point. And so it's also an opportunity to gently delineate an area of ignorance to someone else when they ask, where is your surname from? And you say the Philippines. And then often, somewhat illogically, given the patriarchal society we live in, they'll immediately say, oh, so your mum is Filipina. And I always find that interesting because it reveals such deep-seated racist perceptions around sexuality, that like Southeast Asian female sexuality is perceived as like hyper-feminized and submissive and like bouncy and squeaky. And so the idea that like a white woman like my mother would want to have children with a Filipino man is like beyond people's immediate presumptions, because the stereotypes around Southeast Asian male sexuality are a little bit harder to spin to your own advantage. Just make sure you have an answer that sits well with you and say it with confidence.
I think one of the things that really resonates in what you're saying for me is the focus on joy, being embedded in these nourishing relationships. That is an important way to heal and to work past this kind of incessant and inescapable feeling of fetishization and othering. And you really feel that in the book when you are talking about that relationship you're building with your Lola and like going to the Philippines at that time. And even like the description of the fruit and the food, that sense of joy is really felt. Finally, if people want to follow you in your work, where can they find you?
So I'm on Twitter, but not very much, at SNSY-Quia, SN-SKIA, but without the hyphen. And then I'm also on Instagram a lot more often because I make lino cut prints and most of what I post about is about those. And my handle is inconveniently difficult, but it is C_EST_QUI77.
So we will link your socials.
Thank you.
We'll link your socials. And of course, Amnion. And I really recommend everybody goes to their local independent bookseller to find Amnion. And I'm just so grateful for you to be in the studio today. Thanks so much, Stephanie.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hi friends, thank you so much for listening to Xeno, a podcast which is all about home, identity and the search for belonging. I'm so grateful to be sharing these conversations with you to help build a more nuanced picture of what belonging means in our world today. Our theme music is by Alex Julian Edwards and our branding is designed by Somewhere Off Grid. If you want to find out more about our upcoming episodes or receive more resources on crafting your sense of home and belonging, you can subscribe to our newsletter at xenocast.org or follow us on Instagram at xeno_pod. I'd really appreciate it if you could share our work with other people, share it with friends who you think might resonate with our message, and rate and comment on our podcast on either Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much for your generous attention and for listening to our stories.